Dear God, thank you for the blessings of the Sabbath. Thank you for the blessings of study and fellowship. Thank you for the blessings of growth and reformation that you give to us so that we can draw closer to you. As you continue and wrap up this work in the story of redemption, I pray and ask that you may be with us as we study together today. I ask for your Holy Spirit to be with us and to guide us as we seek truth that hopefully shines a light on your character and guides us in the right direction as to regards to what your character is. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So, I guess as a brief means of introduction into who I am, my name is Curtis. I've had the opportunity to speak with some of you, but I don't know most of you. And so my name is Curtis. I'm based in the UK under Elder Emma's fellowship, and I teach sometimes, and I'm just a member here in the UK as part of Time Is Now fellowship. So, for a brief bit of context, seeing as I guess this is one of the first studies with regards to the different perspectives of the Sunday law, my journey, if you will, with regards to these studies started in November, at least when I publicly shared my views on the Sunday law. And that's off the back of the studies that Elder Terry did in May, in June, July. And in that time period, like everyone else, I sought to understand what was being suggested for myself, see if I could come to grips with where we are in a way that made sense for me. And so, over the last couple of months from when this initiative started as a movement, my studies have somewhat grown, but have remained fixed on the core concepts that I discussed in November last year in the UK camp meeting. So I hope that I'm able to cover as much detail as I can. We'll have a Q&A at the end where if you've watched anything or heard anything that I've said publicly and you want to question something about that, feel free. It's not limited to what we go through today. Um, Let me just pull up my screen 2 seconds. So as we go through today's presentation, um, I said there'd be a Q&A at the end, but please feel free to ask clarifying questions as we go along. Um, I want to be able to cover everything, but it's hard to do if I'm dialoguing in between. So if you have something that you'd like to ask me that's pertinent to the point that's being discussed, then feel free to raise your hand in the chat, and Elder Emma hopefully will be able to spot your hand, and I'll try and answer your question on the spot. But more broad, general questions, if you could leave those to the end, that would be appreciated. Um, so, our first study today is going to be about time setting and understanding the relationship between time and the Sunday law. And I guess this became part of our movement in that dispensation between 2001 and 2014, on the line of the priests, at least. And there's a reason why truth unfolds in a certain way. If you think of the core concepts that you learn at school, everything builds on top of each other so as to lay the foundations for your education throughout your education. And so line upon line was the first thing in that dispensation, 1989 to 2001, as being the cornerstone of our methodology, if you will. And nothing's fundamentally changed from that. When Elder Parminder starts teaching about parable methodology, it's not a break, it's not something new. all that it really is, put simply, is line upon line. It's taking something you know in a story in history or something around you and comparing it to your own history in a line upon line type of fashion. And so that is, I'm suggesting, should be the backbone of all our studies in trying to understand where we are. And then the second is that follows that dispensation is that time period between 2001 and 2014. Sorry. And as we all know, that was the dispensation in which time was our test as movement, because Adventism had pretty much put time setting aside from 1863. And so we're in spiritual darkness, but God needs to reintroduce it into their church because of the recognition of how important time setting is, not just as a calculation of dates, but because, as we'll discuss in our second presentation, everything that is packaged into time setting beyond the calculation of dates. So while this first presentation will just be calculating dates and stuff, I want us to keep at the back of our minds that there's things that God wants to teach us when we do calculate dates. And if you have any questions as we go along, then as I said, please note them down, and then we can try and go through them together at the end. So I guess as our first point in which we start understanding time is a recognition that William Miller used time with regards to the 2520 in a very different way compared to all the other time prophecies. All the other time prophecies that you have in the Bible, the 2300 days, the 490, which is a part of that, 1335, etc., can all be developed as literal time prophecies in the Bible. So you have the Bible explicitly saying it's this much time from a certain waymark till the end of that waymark. Whereas William Miller does something different. He goes into Leviticus 26 and he reinterprets the original context about that history, about intensity and increasing intensity, into a symbol that's going to be used as time. He didn't really grasp what he was doing, but in terms of that change, and Adventism has struggled with this idea. Can you even do that? Is it a time prophecy? And then Elder Parminder, in this dispensation, 2001 to 2014, starts going into details with regards to the 2520. So he does a series in 2009, 2520 revealed, and then 2012 predicts the Sunday law in 2014. And the mechanism that he uses to do that is the 2520. I'm just giving a brief overview recap of how we use time and what time means for us, so that when we start using time, we can be grounded in knowing that we're using it correctly. So in 2012, he does a study about how, well, really going back to 2009, about how the 2520 in Leviticus 26 can be seen throughout the Bible in different places. And one of the key passages is that story in Daniel, where Daniel is talking about Belshazzar's feast, and you see Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin written on the wall. For Daniel, what's interesting is he reads those words, and those words have a specific meaning with regards to measurements of weight. So you have those words written on the wall, and if you read the literal definition of those words, it's weight, it's units of measurement, and if you add them up, you get to 126 shekels in terms of those weights. But when you convert those shekels into geras, which is just another currency, if you will, another a measurement of weight, you end up with 2520 Geras. And so these terms 2520 and 126 become interchangeable because they're referring to the same thing. And you see this in the scattering of the papacy from 538 up until 1798, where the 1260, as we know, forms a part of the 2520. One of those 2520s is split into two, where you have 126 leading up to 538, and then another 1260 leading up to 1798. So these become interchangeable terms. And the key point in that study about the Sunday law in 2014 is, where do you start the scattering and where does that gathering end? And so the first thing Elder Parminder does is demonstrate that from our time of the end, or leading up to our time of the end, there's 126 years from 1863, when we'll say the church goes into a scattering. And so the question is, like the Millerites, they had two primary 2520. They had two 2520s in which they should have grappled with. William Miller focuses on one, then Hiram Edson focuses on another, and that whole history, etc., etc. But Elder Parminder recognizes that in 1888, there was a lot going on externally and internally with regards to the glorious land and God's people. Externally, we have the Blair Bill, as we all know the history about that and the passage of a Sunday law. But internally, there's a message that's going to be given by A.T. Jones and E.J. Wagner, which is righteousness by faith. And that's what the third angel's message is. Ellen White says that the message from A.T. Jones and Wagner is the third angel's message in verity. And so those are the two components of the Sunday law. Externally, you have certain events, and internally, you have the third angel's message being empowered by messengers talking about righteousness by faith. And so this is going to be key to our study as we go along. The components of 1888 is that there's external events associated with it, and there's internal messages that are given to empower the third angel. So in 2018, the dispensation after 2014, leading up to 2019, Elder Tess is going to stand up and she's going to do a series of studies about Pyrrhus, etc., etc. But she looks back at that history. She looks back at that history of 2009, 2012, sees how time is being used, and she uses time in a similar way to make certain points. And the three that at least I've identified in which she uses time is with the 273. She sees a number in the story of Acts 27 within a certain dispensation between Panium and the Sunday law. And she gets that literal number and changes it into a symbol to take you into a history in the past. So the point is that something is taken out of its literal context and then shape-shifted into a symbol to refer to something else. 273 Levites in Chronicles and etc. And so now it becomes associated with that dispensation of the harvest of the Levites. And then she goes back into time and drops you into 273 BC in the history of Pyrrhus. Sorry, could Zephora mute their mic? Or okay, thank you. So she goes back into history and sees that this is now a story about the king of the north and the king of the south and the Diadochi wars and etc. So that's one way she uses time. Taking a number, shape-shifting it into a symbol, and seeing that that symbol refers to something else. That's exactly what Elder Parminder does with the 126. The second way she uses it is to establish that 2019 is the waymark of the close of probation on the line of the priests. And if you remember those studies, she gets all those different symbols, which are really 2520s, packaged up, the 490, 81, etc., etc. If you remember all those different numbers that she uses, and she demonstrates that if you go back into history and you have these different characteristics um, in history, you can demonstrate that they all point to 2019 in a certain way. And my point in saying that is that that's grounded on line upon line. It doesn't look like it at first glance, but line upon line is really just here's a history about Napoleon, here's your history, we'll say 144,000, that's today, and you read that Napoleon became a dictator in a certain year, and you want to know what's happening today, and you recognize that, okay, at this waymark, I expect a dictator. Um, and so there's a certain number that she's going to use to connect these histories. So, what's the point of using time when you do that? I've described it in some of my past presentations as a magnifying glass. If you are going to do line upon line, how do you know where to look? Because you could just take any history and lay it on yours and say, okay, that happened in that history, it's going to happen in my history. But God's given us tools, the 2520 specifically, to help guide you with regards to where to look. So one of the ways would be, yes, 1888. I want to know when that's going to repeat in my history. And so you have the 126. It's going to point you in the direction of 2014. And that's what's going to connect these two histories. And then you have to start comparing and contrasting them, doing line upon line. So time is built on line upon line. They're inseparable. Um, Time is needed to help you understand where you are in history, and then it's your job to do line upon line to go from the literal to the spiritual, etc. And then the third way Elder TS uses time in 2018 is in establishing November 9 as the date, the month and day for that waymark of raffia or war on the Western Front, however you're going to describe it. Raffia could be packaged as the whole year, but specifically war on the Western Front, this war between the King of the North and the USA internally, civil war, as you may have heard it described, is going to be established with this the symbol of November 9. And she goes into history again and shows how November 9 keeps popping up as significant with regards to the events that we expect to take place at that waymark. Um, does that make sense for now in terms of how time has been used in the past to establish our messages? Okay. So when we think about our Sunday law and the time in which we're living in, one of the things that you need to do as a student of prophecy is you have a set of characteristics for a waymark. Whether it's the Sunday law, whether it's the time of the end, or the close of probation, or whatever waymark that you have in mind. You have read the conflict of the ages, you've studied the Bible, and so you have certain expectations of what a waymark represents or what events should take place at a waymark. So some of the things, there's a big list that we can come up with. One of the things that we know is that the King of the North goes into the glorious land. And the King of the North does that to establish a new world order, to establish a different way of running things in the glorious land. They are going to rise up, or they've risen up to that point of being the king in the glorious land, but they want to take over the world. And so it starts this process from the Sunday law up until the close of probation to rule the world. And we get that story in the verses of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. First, the glorious land, and then I think it's verse 43 or 44 that talks about now the king of the north is going to stretch their hands over Egypt, um, which is a symbol of the world. So, one is you have a new world order, which is basically a new way in which to organize the world. That's what a new world order means. New world order. The seventh kingdom, depending on which story you're telling, is established. It sets its status as a superpower because the king of the north and the seventh kingdom go hand in hand. So the king of the north, the seventh kingdom is a superpower in a way in which it wasn't before. And this king of the north is ruling over everyone else. There's no um, bilateral world order. There's no other superpower that can contest this kingdom that's been established. When we explore Daniel 11 and that transition between Medo-Persia and Greece, um, we mark Ahasuerus as being the fourth king that's far Ahasuerus or Artaxerxes. Um, okay, I'll slow down. Um, we mark Ahasuerus, I think it's Artaxerxes, as the fourth king that's far richer. And the point that we take from that study is that Donald Trump is the last king of the sixth kingdom. And then there's this period of time between the end of the sixth kingdom and Xerxes as being that last king. And then you get Alexander the Great that rises up in Greece. Greece has a specific characteristic associated with it, which is that it's a kingdom that rules over the whole earth. You get that from Daniel 2, verse 39. And so these are some of the characteristics. There's a lot more, but these are the ones that I want to focus on, is understanding how Greece takes over the world. Greece is a newly established superpower in politics. And then internally, you have other characteristics that you can pull out of Ellen White's writings, one of which is the investigative judgment of the living, and etc., etc. So when you look at these characteristics and how I've described how we've used time in the past, my suggestion was you have your characteristics. Now you're going to use those symbols that are really just the 2520 to connect you to a different history, to connect you to a history so that you can do compare and contrast. And so in my studies, there's several that we'll go through now that I'm suggesting connect our history to histories in the past. The first one that I want to speak about is the year 1898. And I'm going to go over this history not in a lot of detail because of time constraints, but if you have the opportunity to do so, I think it would be beneficial to explore this history in a bit more detail. But in 1898, it's widely considered to be the year that the USA rises as a superpower. Prior to that point, it had pretty much focused on its own domestic policies, its own domestic problems, if you will, in trying to recover from the Civil War, in trying to in its expansionist ideology within the boundaries of the USA. But as time progressed and they grew militarily with regards to their navy, their economy, and etc., they started flexing their muscles a bit more outside their borders. And 1898, yes, 1898. 1898 was the year in which, if you Google, the USA became a superpower with regards to the rest of the world. So I'll just read briefly from a couple of sources to make the point that I'm making. One of which is the state government's website itself in the USA. It says the global equilibrium, which had allowed the United States to grow and prosper in virtual isolation since 1815. So the USA is growing within its borders. All the other European countries are at war with themselves and trying to take over territories and etc., not really caring what's going on in the USA. It gives the USA this opportunity to grow without getting involved outside its borders. Reading on, was gone forever as the result of a short but shattering war. In 1898, U.S. domestic support for the independence of Cuba enmeshed the United States in a struggle with Spain over the fate of the island nation. So Cuba was fighting for its independence against Spain, and the USA decides to intervene. They decide to get involved, and they get involved in this civil war and essentially kick Spain out. They tell Spain, get off our borders. Cuba is one of our protectorates, and after that, the USA really rises up with regards to its prominence on the world stage. So before it was a rising nation, but now that nation has risen. Um, Reading on from the same source, um, in the 1898 Treaty of Paris, ending the war in Cuba, gave Cuba its independence and also seceded important Spanish territories to the United States. So now the United States is going to be marked as an imperial power. They weren't before. All the imperial powers were Spain, Great Britain, France, etc. But now the USA is going to become an imperial power. And so the United States was suddenly a colonial power with overseas dependencies. I've dropped that quote in the chat that you can read in detail. And then the next one, just to re-emphasize this point, is that if there was a single, this is reading from Vox.com. I'll put this one in the chat as well. If there was a single moment when the US became a global power, it was the war with Spain, this one that we've just described in 1898. The Spanish Empire had been crumbling for a century, and there was a ferocious debate within the US over whether America should become an imperial power to replace it. This centered on Cuba. Pro-imperialists wanted to purchase or annex it from Spain. So the key point is that historians and political commentators mark 1898 as the year when the USA becomes a superpower on the world stage. And there's various other sources where you can read the same thing. I want to go to A.T. Jones's commentary about this because it sheds light on what some of the motivations were with regards to this war. So before doing that, just taken off Wikipedia, I think. No, off from a book called The Cross of War, Christian Nationalism and UX Expansion in the Spanish-American War. In that time period, Protestantism and Catholicism were, as we know, at odds, especially coming out of that 1260. And so Protestants in the USA were some of the biggest voices supporting this war with Spain. And they called it a humanitarian war. not because they were fighting for self-interest or conquest and wanting to take territories, but from their perspective, they viewed this war with Spain in 1898 as being for the benefit of humanity. So, from their eyes, this was benefiting humanity because it was a triumph of Protestant USA, giving it the opportunity to send missionaries into all these Catholic territories. Spain was a Catholic nation, predominantly Catholic, and when it colonized these different islands, the Philippines, Cuba, etc., it took its Catholic religion to these nations. So they see this as an opportunity to get Protestantism to convert those Catholic territories into Protestant believing nations. And so now it's framed as a holy war. It's given a religious meaning by Protestants in the land. In Americanism, this is a booklet, I think. Or no, it's a chapter in a book or series of articles by A.T. Jones. Um, in the American Sentinel. So when you have the time, you can read through this Sentinel, and he writes this in May 19, 1898, pages 311 or 312. Basically, in that, to summarize, in that article, he is commenting about this war with Spain and the consequences that come from this war in the USA's imperial march in conquering the Philippines. And he looks at what's going on and he recognizes that this is false patriotism. There's something wrong here with what the USA is doing and with regards to its motivations in going to war. And so he decries the cruel policies that stem from warped nationalism that had permeated the society in America as a result of church going into politics. So he's recognized that Protestants have taken and manipulated politics to serve this agenda of going to war with all these different nations. So the point is, from all of that, that 1898 is widely considered as the year that the USA becomes a global superpower. And it was Christian nationalism that spurred this war. It was church going into politics, church and state, that spurred this war, that spurred the USA becoming this global superpower. So if you would have done your calculations, um, my suggestion is that it's the 126 that connects these 2 years to 2024. Because when we're studying the Sunday law, um, there's three different elements I'm going to suggest that we need to take into consideration. The year, because it's all well and good understanding what month something points to, but how do you know which year that month is a marker in? Is it 2023? Is it 2025? Etc. Etc. Or is it 2024? And so one of the things in my thinking, at least when trying to understand the Sunday law, is okay, what year is the Sunday law, first of all? And how can we prove that? And then once we do that, we can get our list of criteria to understand what the issues are at the Sunday law. And so 1898 ties, or 126 ties 1898 to 2024 as the year of the Sunday law. This isn't the only thing that takes place externally in the USA. Um, in the Bible, there's different numbers which are symbols of different things, and 10, the number 10, um, as should all come to your mind, is a symbol of a test. And 2014 being the Sunday law on the line of the priests, we have 2014 connected to 2024 by this symbol of a test, 10 years. And so this is what I'm suggesting is giving me license to go and compare and contrast 1888 with 1898. So 1888, I had said internally, you have the message of righteousness by faith by H. Jones and Wagner, which was essentially how God, Christ, lives within you, humans, um, to establish you as a person in seeking glory. So you'd have heard the phrase, Christ in you, the hope of glory. That's what righteousness by faith is. It's how you as a person can be righteous with Christ living within you. Um, so they give that message in 1888, and they, Jones and Wagner, fail as messengers because they don't accomplish their job. But leadership, Uriah Smith, um, Butler, etc., essentially tell them to park their message. And now the church and Jones, Wagner, and Ellen White are going to go into the struggle, and the church is basically going to separate them. They're going to send them to different parts, to Europe, the US, and to Australia. Ellen White goes to Australia. But in that time period, she doesn't remain silent. She's constantly telling them that this message by H.E. Jones and Wagner um, is the third angel's message. It's everything that I've been saying all along in a different way. And 1898 is the culmination of her works with regards to the life of Christ. In 1898, she writes The Desire of Ages. She writes or finishes writing and then publishes The Desire of Ages. So externally, you have this transition in the status of the USA to a superpower. Internally, when we say internal, we mean the church. Desire of Ages is published. And I'm hoping you all would have read Desire of Ages because it's it's really this message of righteousness by faith packaged in a way that can be sent to the world. She had it in her mind, if you read that history carefully, of using this book as an evangelical tool for the world. So when you read about Great Controversy and its purposes, why there's two editions, you would have heard that the 1888 edition was for the church and the 1911 edition was for the world. It's the exact same dynamic with the message of righteousness by faith. The church first hears this message in 1888, and then Ellen White in 1898 finishes writing Desire of Ages, and there's discussions about who's going to publish the book, etc., etc. But the point is, this book needed to be written in a specific way that could be consumed by a general audience, not just Adventists. It was really a tool to evangelize to the world. It from the perspective of righteousness by faith. That whole story of Jesus's life on earth is a story of Jesus being the example for us, of Christ dwelling within humanity to achieve glory, to achieve righteousness. And so this is my compare and contrast with 2014, 2024, 1888, and 1898. Does that make sense for now in terms of why I've gone to these histories and what the compare and contrast is between the two? Okay. So just to add a bit of weight to what I'm suggesting about 2024 is the different time periods that lead us to 2024. The first of which is the 220 as a symbol that we get in the Bible. or as a symbol that we derive from the Bible, um, brings us to the year 1804. So using the 220, taking us to 1804, one of the things that takes place in that year is that Napoleon Bonaparte crowns himself the Emperor of the French, of France. And this marks the start of the first French Empire. And so we have made several applications of how Napoleon as a dictator parallels Trump as a dictator, the dictator established at the Sunday Law. Now, when we do compare and contrast or line upon line, we know that when we go from a history where something is literal and we go to the spiritual, we take the characteristics or the principle of that. We can't go from literal to literal. So when you see dictator here and you take that to your history and you see dictator, one of the things you can't do is say Napoleon was a king or an emperor and his dictatorship looked like XYZ. You can't take that literally and say, okay, literally, Trump is going to demolish the system completely and establish himself as a dictator in the same way that Napoleon did. It's you have to go from the literal to metaphorical. So when we say dictator, yeah, we need to be really careful and considerate of what it means to be a dictator in the 21st century. The second that I'd like to suggest is 1844. 180 is a symbol that we have explored in the context of Esther and the Ahasuerus and the feast or the war planning session that Ahasuerus is going to have before he goes to war. And he does that for 180 days. And before he goes for his military campaign against Greece. Um, and that's one of the things that we expect at the Sunday law. It's that there's this preparation that needs to be done before the king of the north can go to war with the world at the close of probation at Daniel 12:1. And so we have the 180 symbol, which brings us to the year 1844. And in 1844, as we all know, that internally, why that was significant for Adventism with regards to the judgment of the dead, with regards to the Sabbath truths being restored, with regards to Seventh day Adventism. I know we can stretch it back to 1798, but it's really 1844 and the Sabbath doctrine that forms the basis of the Seventh day Adventist Church as commencing. And I hope we know that 180 is midway. It's a symbol of midway. Why? Because in a year there's 360 days, and midway is 180 and 180. So it's a symbol of midway. And the Sunday law on our timeline with our 5 waymarks is that middle waymark. It's midway on the line of the 144,000. So separate to the internal things that take place in 1844 with regards to the judgment of the dead, the investigative judgment of the dead. Externally, as Elder Tess has explained and demonstrated, we have the election of 1844, which is really going to change the USA's footprint or its vision with regards to what type of nation the USA is going to be. That election in 1844 between Henry Clay and James Polk really is a turning point with regards to the slavery question and the US expansionism. The underlying thing that Polk is going to run on is Manifest Destiny, which was this belief that the United States, needed to expand across the North American continent. It was destined to do that. Um, and everything that happens after this point with the 1850 compromise, with the Civil War, and etc., can be traced back to this election and James Polk, and his policies. One of the interesting things as well, which often gets overlooked, is while expansion was the major issue of this election in 1844, it was economic concerns played a role as well, with debates about tariff and the national bank and how the US is going to make money, essentially. And the outcome, as we're familiar with, is that James Polk wins, and um, because of this support for his expansionist policies and his appeal and etc. etc. So the next history that I want to suggest that connects to our own is 1873 and the 151. In 1873, in Germany, you had what was called a culture Kampf. Culture Kampf. In English, that translates to cultural struggle. Without going into too much detail, it was essentially policies initiated by the chancellor in Germany to silence and really persecute the Catholic Church, because half of the nation was Protestant and the South was largely Catholic. So you have the North as Protestant, the South as Catholic, and Chancellor von Bismarck, etc., viewed Catholicism as a threat to national unity as a whole, because the Catholic Church had pledged allegiance to the Pope in Rome. And so he starts instituting all these different laws, what were the May laws in 1873, to establish state control over the Catholic Church. So the point is that there's this culture war taking place in 1873. In that story, it's between the state and a church, a minority, if you want to call it that, a marginalized group in 1873. Just like in 1888, the Catholic Church, the Catholics were the persecuted group, if anything. Um, the next one is 1914, and the 110 that brings you to 1914. And in 1914, that's when World War One starts. I won't give you the history of that. It's just when the Archduke is assassinated, and then the world spirals into World War One. The next one is 1961, and the connection with our time is that this was when the Berlin Wall was erected. And what we see at the Sunday law, metaphorically speaking, is that the Berlin Wall falls with the death of the King of the South, metaphorically speaking. Um, so it's in some stories you have the same, God showing you the end from the beginning. In other ways, it's flipped, it's the opposite. One example of this is the 2520 itself. You have at the beginning a scattering, but at the end you have a gathering, so an opposite. But in other stories, you have the beginning is something and you see the same thing at the end. And then wrapping up this bit is that the next one is 2009. Sorry, I didn't put the symbol that does this for us. It's 63. The next is 2009, which is 15. And 2009 was what arguably could be considered the birth of the Tea Party movement, this conservative populist political movement. Alder Tess has spoken about the Tea Party movement in quite a lot of detail as a response to economic policies. And we'll speak about this in a bit more detail in our next presentation. But one thing that I want to point out is that, yes, the Tea Party movement and its rise really precipitated what we see today with regards to the Republican Party and the Trump administration. As well, connected to that was the swine flu, and the global pandemic associated with the swine flu. So it was a plague, if you want to call it that. We know that on the line of the Levites, on the line of the Nethinim, sorry, from the Sunday law to the close of probation, that's their Jacob's time of trouble on at a fractal level. And one of the components of Jacob's time of trouble is plagues. Um, we'll discuss that in a bit more detail just now. The next one is 2014. And um, one of the things that takes place in 2014 is this story about Crimea. Crimea is annexed, and that's 10 years. That brings you to 2024. It's the midpoint of, I'm suggesting, the midpoint of Putin's dictatorship. 2004 with the Beslan school siege and etc. Political commentators mark that as really the first point where you can see that Putin is not really going to rule in a democratic way. He's going to manipulate information to establish his dictatorship. Um, and then in 2024, I'm suggesting that's the end of that midpoint between 2004 and 2024. 2014 being that midpoint. And then the last one is 2019, um, which um, was COVID, really. Um, Again, making that parallel between Jacob's time of trouble and the plagues. Another thing that took place in 2019 actually was a measles outbreak, the biggest measles outbreak that the US had seen in more than 25 years. Um, and if it hadn't escaped your attention, currently in the US, there's a measles outbreak. A large part of that is driven by the drop in vaccination levels that the US has seen after COVID. Um,
Imbe achala kono. Aleti ang mo chir manien.
sorry,
Mo niar ki.
Philip, could you mute your mic? Thank you. So each of these histories can be expounded on, and I'd love for you to go into each of those histories to understand what each of them are. But the point is, in doing all that, is that when we consider methodology and how we use methodology, we can compare and contrast it, different histories, but how do we know where to look? And I'm suggesting it's these different symbols, the 220, 180, 151, 110, that are all taken from the Bible, or at least shapeshifted in different forms from the Bible, that point you in the right direction with regards to where to look, how to know where you can compare and contrast. When we think about our methodology, there's two different options that you have as a student. Option one is you can compare and contrast, which is line upon line, really. And then the second option you have is what's now come to be known as threading. It's just progression. Um, so if you ask yourself, how do I know which to use and when? This is my suggestion. Line upon line was established in the dispensation after 1989 to 2001. It's what plowed us. It's what plowed the 144,000. It's what did the plowing for the priests and etc. So it should be the cornerstone in methodology. Progression is when you look in your history after you've done compare and contrast. So you've got your history about Hitler, and you want to understand your history Hitler, dictator, and you going to say dictator, or you go to Pyrrhus and you see war. So you're going to come down to your history and you'll see war. That's your compare and contrast. The next step is to do threading or progression, where you have your different waymarks in your dispensation, and you want to ask the question, what does war look like in my history? Because I can't take elephants from Pyrrhus's history and say, I'm going to expect elephants today. What you're going to do is go to your first waymark, 1989, and see, okay, that's the birth of the information age. And you're going to see this continual story with regards to war using information. Hello,
Whatever.
Elizabeth. Please could you mute? Thank you. You're going to see war with regards to information. And that's step two. What are the dangers of starting here? Of starting doing it the other way around? Of using threading first, or not even first, just using threading, is that, in my opinion at least, it's extremely subjective. Is that you want to know what happens at the Sunday law. First of all, when the Sunday law is and what the issue is at the Sunday law. The suggestion is that if you do threading, how do you know which waymark ends that thread or which waymark to choose as part of that thread? How do you know? Because you could have one story that you're telling, which could be pretty legit, or I could have another story that could seem pretty legit. But what's going to ground me in knowing what the truth is? Solomon says that there's nothing new under the sun. And that's really just an expression of this idea of line upon line. The point that Solomon is making is that human nature is is invariable. It doesn't change too much when you go from history to history. All that changes is the technology of the times or the circumstances, but really how humans behave from when the sun rose to when the sun sets is not going to be fundamentally different. So knowing that in our minds, line upon line, now gets imprinted with regards to understanding the nature of humanity. If I know that humans are going to behave in a certain way under economic pressures, a populist is going to rise up. Hitler, after the economic Great Depression, I know what should I expect when I see a recession in my history. I should expect a populist to rise up, because each time that happens, populists rise up. Julius Caesar rose to power in the exact same way because humans don't fundamentally change. That's line upon line. It's taking that into recognition and saying, okay, so in this history, I know this happened. So when I see this happen in my history, I know what the resulting effect is going to be. Um, so I've gone on for an hour. Um, I'll I'll end with this one point, um, which I'll go over very briefly. So the first thing that I wanted to do in establishing that was the year of the Sunday law, because there's different suggestions of what year the Sunday law takes place. So at least I'm suggesting this is a way to determine what year the Sunday law takes place. The second is when in that year is the Sunday law. Now, I've done this study in a lot more detail than I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes. Um, so if you have the opportunity, I'd encourage you to watch those other studies. Um, but the point is, when we consider the rise of Hitler, I want to understand this history between 2021 and what I'm saying is 2024. Where can I look? We've often made connections with Hitler and his rise and today and the rise of Trump. The way Hitler rose was interesting. The first, let me do it this way. The first way in which Hitler tried to take over the government was through a revolt, a revolution. He'd just seen what had happened in Italy with Bonaparte. He had bought into the it was really propaganda that Bonaparte was spreading with regards to how he rose. But anyway, he sees that and thinks, I can take over the Weimar Republic in the same way. And so in 1923, at in what's now being called the beer hall pushed, he's going to try and start this national revolution. He marches into a beer hall where um, one of the Weimar's um, chief commissioners is giving a speech, and he fires a pistol in the air and declares a national revolution. That was on November the 8th, I think. And then the next day, he gathers about 2,000 Nazi supporters and he goes into Munich, and with these supporters, he tries to take down the government. He tries to overthrow the government, but he fails. He fails in this political coup, and he ends up being charged and convicted for his crimes, and he goes to jail. The judges gave sympathy to him, so his jail term is reduced, and etc. But in that time, he writes Mein Kampf, the infamous book that details Hitler's ideology. And in that book and in his trial, he shouts and uses the platform to deny his actions and justify them as patriotic. And so he gets sympathy from right wing nationalists. Um, but in that journey, in his time in prison, he recognizes something that I failed in 1923. So I'm going to pursue power through legal and political means by gaining influence within the democratic system and then dismantling it from the inside. And so in 1933, he sees, this is my chance. This is my opportunity to rise. And he was essentially handed power by the conservative um, parties around him because they were losing power, the different conservative parties, and they saw Hitler as a useful tool to get back into power. And so they go into this coalition government and they say to Hitler, if you become chancellor, we'll put our people around you so we can have this coalition between the Nazis, the DNVP, the different conservative parties, and amongst themselves they thought, okay, but Hitler is pretty dangerous, so what can we do? And so they decided we'll surround him with center right candidates in terms of who holds the money, who runs different state processes um, in cabinet. And so Hitler is essentially handed power by the conservatives. And when we think of the term gatekeeping, this is where I've spoken of it in the past in this context, is that conservative elites who were supposed to bottle up this populace, this danger, this threat, Hitler, end up handing power to him, thinking that they could use him as a puppet to advance their own agendas. Um, so there's all this deal making that goes on. And in 1933, they appoint Hitler as chancellor. to run parliament. Um, if you read into the different motivations of Hindenburg, which was one of the Conservative Party leaders, he looks back at it, or after the fact, he looked back at it with regret, thinking, what have I just done? I've just miscalculated, believing I could control Hitler. But as history tells us, they underestimated Hitler and everything that he sought to do. Um, when commentators look back at January 6th, I think a few days after January 6th in 2021, they saw similarities between the events of the January 6th riots and that beer hall push where Hitler tries to overthrow the government. And so there's various articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post where you can read this parallel, this compare and contrast that was done between those two. And the studies that I've done up until this point have suggested this same thing, that at the Sunday law, the marker for the Sunday law is the same marker that we have for Hitler gaining power. It was the Conservative Party, in our context, the Republicans, that fail as democracy's gatekeepers. They fail to maintain that stability because they sell out in seeking political opportunity, they hand over power to Trump. And so that has been, I know I've not explained it in as much detail now, but that has been my argument as to why July 18 at least is the marker for the Sunday law, is because of that parallel with Hitler. And throughout history, it's not just Hitler. Democracy's gatekeepers have consistently been conservative parties because they play a special role in keeping out those far right populists, those, or in for today, a neo-Nazi, if you want to call it that way. They um, serve a specific role in protecting democracy, your conservative parties. The other history that I've sought to use to demonstrate this, this will be the last one, is 63 BC. In the story of Raphia, Panium, Daniel 11, etc., etc., 63 BC is when Pompey marches into the glorious land. And that's what Rome is doing outside its borders. But inside its borders, Julius Caesar goes into an election. And that election was for a role called Pontifex Maximus, which was the head of the church, the head of all churches, actually. And that's where today the Catholic Church gets the term pontiff from. Um, Hello, sorry, Oh Guang, thank you. Um, and his two opponents in that election for Pontifex Maximus were um, the two names of the people were Quintus Lutatius Catulus, and the other was Publius Servilius Isauricus. Without going into the meaning of their names, just what role they served in ancient Rome and that election was they were what were called the I can't remember the name, but they were part of the Conservative Party at the time. There were two primary parties, the Populists and the Conservatives, and Quintus and Publius were in the Conservative Party. They recognized that Julius Caesar was a danger. He was a threat to the nation, and so they run specifically against Julius Caesar because they see that he's going to manipulate Senate's authority. He's going to manipulate the Senate's authority and Senate control and etc. Oh yes, they were the optimates. Optimates. And so they serve a role in protecting the establishment of the time, really, in ancient Rome. And it was the conservatives that did that. And then they fail, and Julius Caesar ends up winning that election. One thing that I will point to, which Elder Terry has elaborated on before, is the meaning of Julius Caesar's name. Caesar meaning elephant killer. So these conservatives fail at gatekeeping, Quintus and Publius. And so in application, I'm suggesting that that's Julius Caesar killing the elephant, the GOP being that symbol of the elephant. And so it's these two stories, Hitler and how he takes over the German government, and Julius Caesar and how he becomes Pontifex Maximus, that I think serve as parallels to the Sunday law, which can identify what the issue is that makes the Sunday law the Sunday law. Now, to close, at the beginning, I said that time points you in the direction of where to look at. And then you compare and contrast your different stories that will point out the issue, the thing that is the marker. On the line of Acts 27, we'll go into that in our next presentation. But in that story of Acts 27, at the midnight cry or Panium, if you will, whatever you want to call it in that story, um, that's Acts 27 verse 27. You have that calculation of distance, and the distance measured is the 2520 because it's the symbol of time that gives you the time until shipwreck comes. There's this distance calculated. So we started off by understanding and describing the different forms of the 2520. It's the 126. It can be called the 7 times, interchangeable with the 1260. All of these things are the same thing. They're the 2520. 7 times being 7 years, 7 literal years. What does Revelation 13 call the 1260? 3.5 times. So 3 years, 6 months. That's what the 2520 is. It's the 126. It's the 7 times 7 years. It's the 1260. It's 3 years, 6 months. All these things are interchangeable. It's the same thing. It's all talking about this idea of judgment, scattering, etc. They're part of the same package. And so when we think of this waymark, what this waymark is, um, in the parallel with Hitler's first revolt, we have January 2021. And in using one of these symbols of the 2520, which is the 3.5 times, if you calculate 3 years, 6 months from January 2021, it brings you to July 2024. And so the question has been asked, if Panium is Exeter on the line of the 144,000, where is the 2520 that we're meant to be calculating from that point that points you to the Sunday law? And so I'm suggesting that here it is. It's your 3 years, 6 months, which is just another way of saying 2520. That brings you from those January riots in 2021 to the July National Convention, which was the culmination of the capitulation of the Conservative Party. So we'll close here for a quick break, and then we'll pick up in our next study. So let's close with a word of prayer. Dear God, Thank you for the opportunity to go through these things together. I appreciate that there's just so much to cover and it's impossible trying to do it in a little amount of time. But I pray that I may have done justice to the study. And I pray that whatever questions people may have, whatever questions I may have, as time goes on, we may seek to answer those questions. Um, Please be with us now as we take a quick break and come back to continue studying together. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.